Please welcome our AI R&D Ethics Panel Moderator, National Security Consultant, Dr. Richard Danzig, and our panelists, Director of the Ethics and Emerging Sciences Board at California Polytechnic State University, Dr. Patrick Lin, Senior Research Analyst at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, Dr. Heather Roff, and Senior Fellow and Director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, Mr. Paul Scharre.
So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about the ethics and philosophy and, for that matter, to some degree, the psychology and politics that surrounds issues in artificial intelligence. I think the session will underscore for many of you that a lot of the problems that matter in this arena relate not just to the technology, but even more to our character as human beings and what values and perceptions and cultural biases, if you will, we bring to this topic. And hopefully it'll have implications for all of you in your work. I forewarned this distinguished trio that we'd begin with a hypothetical that poses a difficult, I think, question. And the hypothetical is simply a future Secretary of Defense, somebody, this is not me, this is somebody who's really competent and impressive in knowledge about AI, brings this trio in and says, you are really three of the most distinguished people who have worked on artificial intelligence. And they are, and particularly from the standpoint of ethics and philosophy. And this future Secretary of Defense says, I want your advice on ethics relating to an invention we've developed. That invention gives us a drone capability for dealing with terrorists that not only is persistent and has the usual surveillance and, for that matter, offensive firepower, but also has the capability of facial recognition of individuals and can apply that firepower accordingly. And we have the capability to observe actions as they occur in real time and make a judgment about whether those are terrorist actions, as for example, by firing, somebody is firing a weapon against our troops. And what I'd like to know is, I've got a lot of technical information, and that information underscores that, in fact, we can do this with an artificial intelligence apparatus embedded in this machine, a capability for intelligence and judgment that in very carefully controlled tests we've shown does better than human beings, or at least as well. It is not worse. And my question, or the future Secretary of Defense asks, she puts this question to you, is this, what do you think about this ethically? Should I, apart from its functional utility, is this something that we should or should not be doing? What's the nature of your thinking about this? So I put this question to the panel, and whoever is least inhibited amongst you should start. I think that's a cue for you, Heather, but it could be anybody.
A cue for me, oh man, okay. So I think that if the Secretary of Defense, future Secretary of Defense, who I hope is a very competent woman, I hope I hope she would ask me this, and my response would be something along the lines of, "Ma'am, I need to have more information." Just because you have a capability, I would like to know, right, the intended use, the scope and duration of use. So if you have kind of this ability, right, we have Gorgon Stare, we have the ability to kind of have persistent surveillance. But is that unmanned area vehicle going to be engaging in something like what's tantamount to aerial occupation of another country? What are our goals and interests in being in that area? Are we in an area that is under what we would call, hostilities, right? Is this a hater mission? Is this, what are the contexts around the use of this system? Because ethics is really about action guidance. So we can have really great ethical principles that tell us what to do, but unless you actually understand the context, you can't apply the principle. So I have a widget, but I need to know how I'm going to use that widget in certain instances. And so I think, I would also then want to know more about their controlled cases, to make sure that those controlled cases look sufficiently like the case of deployment, right? So within machine learning, I might have my training set, but my test set, right, if these things look very different, we could end up in some serious trouble. And then that would become, I would say, a very unethical use of the system, right? If you use a system that was trained to identify individuals doing terrorist acts, right, only in, say, particular physical environments, and then you change that system to a wildly different physical environment, will the behavior of the individual under observation be affected by the background noise or something of that?
So let me just ask, and then we'll by all means encourage Paul and Pat to add their comments or reactions. But if I'm playing the role of Secretary of Defense, what I'm trying to get at is something beyond the very legitimate questions you're raising. Yes, you can go and ask about controlled trials, and you can ask about context. But if, for example, I was recommending torture, I think you'd have views about the instrument itself apart from its context. Yes, its context would also matter to you. And I want to know whether you have reservations about the instrument itself using an autonomous system, a lethal autonomous weapons system. The acronym is LAWS, which is paradoxically and congenial or ironically used. Should I have reservations about that, or can I accept that and go on to the other questions you're raising?
I think in this instance of the hypothetical scenario of some very intelligent system
Right.
that can identify terrorism in real time,
Right.
which is not a visual class that we can really figure out anyway, I think, in that kind of very, very hypothetical world, I still would say that I have some reservations about that use and that kind of capability.
And would you like to say something about what those are?
I am notorious in some instances of being very cautious around the use of autonomy in lethal decision making. Our own government, and Paul was part of this process, we have a policy regarding this, that we want to be cautious about the use of autonomy. We don't preclude it, but we want to be cautious around it for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is, I think, that the value of taking human life has to be is a weighty decision, and perhaps there is something morally important about humans making that decision. In an offensive capacity where there's extended time, or there's not the pressures of needing autonomy because there's not a human there, or you're not facing something that's in a picosecond, I think that that decision to employ lethal force becomes even more morally important for a human commander to start making. And if the Secretary of Defense at this point would say, I employ the authorization in the use of the system, then I would say, okay, but who's got eyes on it to make sure that it's doing right? Because even in our Law of War manual, we do have, within our Law of War manual, a requirement for human commanders to make decisions regarding proportionality and distinction. And that doesn't change if the target is a terrorist.
Do you guys want to in on this?
Yeah, sure. So let me answer your first question. What if SecDef came to me and asked, hey, do we have an ethical green light to field this system? I guess the first thing I would say, in line with Heather, is we're going to need more information. So a lot of the ethics is contextual. It's not so much about the technology per se, but it could be about a specific application. I would also say that, look, if you're taking ethics seriously, as you should, I would hope that a deeper ethics conversation has been going on this whole time, right? Years in parallel of the technology's development. Because ethicists we're fairly cheap, right? We're 12 for 10 cents. So we don't cost a lot. But to bring someone in at the very last moment before you press go, again, that sounds weird.
I have to say, Pat, this is very familiar to me. I'm a lawyer, and basically what you're saying is what all lawyers say, which is, I need more information and pay me.
Right.
Which I get.
That's exactly what I'm
By
saying.
the hour.
But Pat, let me just ask you for a second. If I said to you, I've got this instrument of torture, would you be saying to me, I need more information and I need more context?
Well, I think it matters what kind of technology we're talking about. I think facial recognition technology added to a weapons package is not the same thing as an Iron Maiden or a rack. It's not the same thing as a torture device. Background is that a lot of people say technology is neutral. I don't believe that at all. technology, every technology has some ethical valence, some ethical spin that can be baked into the design. Most of the time we don't see it because it's okay, but other times, such as torture devices, human gas chambers, we recognize these as evil technologies in and of themselves, right, regardless of use. So,
and this is not.
But this is not clearly that. I mean, it might be a gray case that's leaning towards of strong concern, but it's not in the same class as a torture device. So I would say, look, there's a lot of lessons you can learn from just the recent drone warfares, right? So, and basically that's what you're talking about. You want to give drones more capability. But if you look at our drone warfare, as it's called so far, it doesn't, for instance, it doesn't do a great job of winning hearts and minds, right? So again, it depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to just take out this one terrorist, okay. But if your goal is to actually create regional peace and make it stable, then that's a whole different ball game. So lessons from a drone wars, every drone strike we have seems to, by some estimates, create 10 more terrorists, right? So it perpetuates this cycle of conflict. So I think we need to have an eye on the prize, eye on the bigger picture. What exactly is the goal here? What exactly is the mission? We got to remember a lot of these technologies, they come home to roost, right? So they not only do we bring them back from our own battlefield, so we have predators working in law enforcement here, but many other countries are developing this technology too. Are we really comfortable with that, with being on the business end of that technology on our soil? So I think we really got to think about what kind of world are we building? Is this a world we want? Now, I can't point to any particular ethical issue that I think is a deal breaker. Some people do. Some people say, these machines just are incapable of respecting human dignity, and that immediately violates a Martin's Clause or some other clause, and therefore there should be a ban. I think that argument goes way too quick. But there might be something to the dignity claim that hasn't been explored.
Well, I want to come back to the dignity issue in a minute, which I know you've written on very usefully. But go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I guess so. I would peel apart your question into kind of three baskets that I would look at this. So one would be, can the machine perform this adequately, appropriately, with the degree of assurance that we want in a real-world environment? And I think Heather would kind of raise that. That's obviously a very challenging condition in a warfare environment, where we don't get to do what companies like Waymo are doing, where you get to test your autonomous system out in the real world. War, gratefully, is not very common. And so most of what militaries do is they train in peacetime. And we trust that people are flexible and adaptable. We tell people things like, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And the machine's not going to have that degree of flexibility. So I think that's like one important concern, right? Let's say you've addressed that. Maybe you actually tested it in real-world combat environments, but with the actual weapons turned off, right? So we could do that. We could do things like that today with the Aegis. When an Aegis destroyer sort of shows up to an area, they'll test it with the weapons turned off. So you've done that. There's another set of questions that revolve around things that humans used to be doing that we want to automate. And now we have to write down the rules. We have to write down rules that people used to do based on intuition, based on judgment. Two words that you used in your description of the scenario that really jumped out at me. One was judgment, machine making a judgment, and the other one was sort of terrorist activity. What does that mean? Yeah. What does that look like? How do I measure that? What is the sensor that I put on this thing to measure terrorist activity? So I'd want to dig into that a little bit better and try to understand, what are we doing that? Would people agree with that assessment? My observation has been that, from my standpoint, when I was in some of these situations in Iraq and Afghanistan on the ground, that these decisions about whether someone is hostile are sometimes quite clear-cut, but in other situations they're quite murky. Someone's approaching and they don't have a weapon, but you tell them to stop and they keep coming. Do they carry a suicide vest underneath? They could be. We certainly face situations like that. Or maybe there's someone who's confused. Maybe they're scared and they don't realize what's going on. I mean, those are very real. There are many situations in war and in other environments where reasonable people could come to different conclusions about what's right to do. And that's getting to many of these ethical questions. Right? So I think that's a really challenging one. even if you solve that, I think this is, and some of this, your question gets to this, is this more fundamental question of, are there some decisions that we don't want machines to make, that only humans should make? And if so, why is that? I think there probably are some decisions like that in war. Heather mentioned the Defense Department's Law of War Manual that actually makes a clear statement on this issue, that there are some decisions that machines should not make. And in this case, the official position of the Defense Department is that only humans are legal agents, that only humans can make a determination about the legality of an action under the laws of war. And that's not something a machine could do. So that if a military professional pushes a button, and we say afterwards, like, why did you do that? Did you think about proportionality and consideration? Did you think about whether that was a legal action? And if their answer is, I don't know, the machine told me to. The machine told me it was legal. That we would say, well, that's inappropriate, actually. That should be, the legality of an attack should be a determination that is reserved for humans. And I think that's probably true in some other domains as well, where there might be some decisions that we say we still want humans to make those, even if machines could.
Well, Paul, let me just ask you about the third one. I want to come back to the first and the second and your very nice trio of points. But the third one, I think, is of central importance, and I'm not sure we've come to grips with it.
Yes.
Your third one is, are there some decisions we don't want machines to make? So assume that we somehow heroically manage to work out our preferences in enough detail that we can program the machine to understand those preferences and apply them. It's an assumption we're going to come back to. Why would I not want to let the machine make the decision? And are you telling me that I should, as a Secretary of Defense in this world, explicitly not embrace this system because I don't want machines absent of the intervention of a human to make that decision?
I think there's a couple reasons why. One might be that there isn't a clear right answer, right? So we saw a presentation earlier on spectrum allocation. There's a clear metric for better, right? Better is more megabits per second transmitted. There are some decisions where there's not a clear metric for what better is. But there also might be some decisions where we actually care about our own involvement in them. So in warfare, for example, you could say that there's a value, an intrinsic value, in humans feeling morally responsible for what happens on the battlefield. That a world where not just machines were doing the targeting and IDing, but a world where people went to bed at night and no human felt responsible for what happened. No human said, I made this decision. It was a tough decision, but we had to make it, and somebody had to do it, and I did that. I take responsibility. That a world where no one is responsible might be more damaging in a number of respects, right? That might degrade how we think about human value of human life in other respects. It might degrade our own morality.
So, Paul, I'm the Secretary of Defense. In one world, I make a decision that bombers should launch and bombs should be dropped, let's suppose in the World War II context, over cities. In another world, I make a decision that a robot should, or a drone should, an autonomous system, loiter and make the decision about when to drop. Do I have a different level of moral appropriateness in those two decisions? Do I feel more responsible as a human, more in the loop in one than the other?
I think that there's some interesting literature on the psychology of killing and war. There's a fascinating book called On Killing by Dave Grossman that talks about how as people are more physically removed from killing on the battlefield, they feel less morally responsible, right? So if someone's in like hand-to-hand combat, you can't really deny what just occurred. If you're bombing someone from 30,000 feet, it seems much more sterile and remote. One of the things that's interesting about technology is that current technology has actually collapsed that distance, right? Where now you could be a drone pilot and you're on the other side of the globe. You're physically very far away, but you could be psychologically actually closer, right, than a fighter pilot who's right overhead because you have more information. I think the challenging thing with this issue is that there are obviously things like post-traumatic stress that come from that association and people's awareness of what they're doing. But I do think that there's some value in people believing that they should be. It's not only about the effect on the end, though. I guess it's a psychology component, right? So it also is about the human-machine interfaces. It's about how we present information to people. It's also about the culture surrounding that person. In 2003, there were a couple of fratricide incidents with the Army's Patriot air defense system. And one of the things that came out afterwards in the post-mortem that the Army did was Patriot operators at the time, and they've changed their culture since then, their training, but at the time, they said that they believed that if they overruled the machine and a missile came in and killed someone, they'd be sort of in more trouble than if they'd let the machine just do its own thing and it maybe shut down a friendly aircraft. So the culture actually reinforced automation bias. And so I think those are there are different ways to structure these incentives. It's not only about the technology, but the incentives for how people think about their own role does matter.
So I want to argue with you a little bit about that, but do the two of you want to comment before?
Well, I mean, I agree with Paul on a lot of these points, and one of the things that I think the hypothetical situation, I see you trying to force the false choice, or force the kind of dichotomous choice here, right? Is it either evil or is it not? And I just don't think that in this instance you can unpack it in that way.
Sorry, Heather, let me just stop you 1 second. The choice is, it seems to me, a very real and practical one, which is, should I, as Secretary of Defense, go ahead with this system? I may hedge it in all kinds of ways, but it's real. It's not, is it evil? It's, do I allow this or don't I?
Well, okay, so let me push back on you for a second.
Sure. Yeah, no,
because you've been
please be
no,
gentle.
because you've been trying to get us to liken this to, well, is it immoral or not? Is it like torture or not?
Right.
And so in that sense, you are trying to ask us, is it mala in se? Is it evil in itself, or is it not? And so I respectfully disagree. But
well, thank you for the respect, but let's stay on the disagreement.
But I would say that within this instance, right? If I have this ability to launch a system that can loiter indefinitely, maybe it's got solar power, it never has to land, right? If I can have this type of system, and I don't know who it's going to target, right? I don't know where it's going to target. I just know that it will go for terrorists. For me, again, as a citizen of the United States and as someone who likes to uphold particular ethical values and values of democracy and enlightenment and human rights and the rule of law and these types of things, I would have to come down on no, ma'am. This would not be a system that I would find ethically viable to deploy. You don't know where it is going to attack. You don't know when it's going to attack. You don't know who it's going to attack. And sometimes you need that space to make those determinations as to whether or not it accords with the particular values and ethics and morals and norms that you hold. May it not catch a terrorist act as it's going off? Perhaps. But perhaps the values that we want to ensure, this is to Pat's point, those are going to be more robust and engage for longer, and we don't want to end up creating a situation where we have eroded and stepped away from those values that we hold so dear.
Well, I think this is a very nice statement, and we're peeling the onion. I feel like you're getting closer to it, and I appreciate your respect in this context. I figured I'd want it when I made the Secretary of Defense a woman, but I thought I'd improve
Can I disagree with Heather?
Go ahead.
So I don't see it quite the same way, I guess. I would say that if you're trying to compare, is this like torture? Is this evil in itself? I would say no. I am less concerned about the.
I'm not saying it's evil in itself. I'm saying that he was making a moral judgment.
Right. Fair enough. But I would say I don't agree with your assessment that I would be that concerned about the specific use of this technology. If you can make it so that it's safe and it's reliable, and if we're comfortable with the actions it's making based on whatever parameters it has, I'd say okay, that's fine. I am more concerned about how we then treat the decision to use this weapon. That's kind of where I come down, right? Where I'd say, yeah, okay, you could use it, but what I don't want is a world where people are launching it and then they don't sort of feel responsible for what happens afterwards, right? That's kind of more what I'm concerned about, is that I would say, look, let's make sure that we put training and a culture in place and doctrine in place so that people are still thoughtful. It doesn't create sort of this moral hazard of carelessness about then the effect of whatever that automated process is.
Yeah. Do two of you agree with that?
I mean, I agree with Paul strongly that responsibility needs to stay in that chain. Responsibility is key. And when you remove the responsibility, that seems to make war and armed conflict easier because you're a little divorced from the situation. I mean, so the situation you pose about the person who makes a call to have a carpet bombing or something versus someone who releases a drone that loiters. Those are two different scenarios. In the first one, it is foreseeable, it is intended that you're going to kill a lot of innocent people on the ground. The second case, you don't know. You don't know if it's going to kill 10 people or maybe 0 people or 100 people or 1,000. So I think there's a case to be made that there's less responsibility in the second instance, in which case that means next time it may be easier to make that go decision. But war is a moral disaster, any which way you cut it, right? Sometimes it's necessary, but no one really wants it. Environmental costs, economic costs, human costs. So I would hope, I mean, this is not the Secretary of Defense's job, but I would hope that we take both a carrot and stick approach, not just all stick, right? So that we're also looking at humanitarian investments, diplomacy, and any other thing to achieve whatever our larger goal is. The immediate goal might be to maybe neutralize this terrorist, but we must have a larger goal, right?
But let me summarize for just a minute, if I can.
Well,
go ahead.
So I hate to, I mean, the hypothetical case is it's really, the ability for a system to do that is so far away, right? And so when you think about how we actually undertake airstrikes from our unmanned platforms now, in the amount of information that the operators and the commanders have, and the JAG officers that sit with them in their cell, in their targeting cells, and the targeteers, and the weaponeers, and all of the different information, all of the human, wetware that goes into this, as well as all of the intelligence that it has from various aspects of intelligence agencies and from people on the ground to make sure that any of the strikes that are taken are in accordance with the laws of armed conflict, right? That's a huge amount of information and prowess that I just think in the hypothetical case, by that point you've created an artificial general intelligence and you probably have a different problem on your hands.
Well, let me try and summarize for a minute. I think there are 2 points here. The first I find completely convincing, and it's articulated by you, Paul, and I'm going to try and summarize it, so correct me if I misstate your position, but it's a position that says there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the device that I've hypothesized. It's that is so subject to abuse because of moral distance, because of a variety of ambiguities, because of what in other contexts you've called brittleness, difficulties in applying to unexpected context. It has a particular set of risks that go with it, and you would only embrace it if you were reasonably comfortable that a whole set of things, infrastructure, what I think you, Heather, are emphasizing as a sort of ecosystem around this, was created in ways that increase the odds that it was used correctly. So there's nothing wrong with the instrument as such, but it demands this care. Is that a fair summary of your?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So before I get to the second point, do you, Pat and Heather, think that's a correct position, a reasonable position, or do you not want to subscribe to it, or you want to criticize it?
I always feel a little bit nervous when we're talking about things that are not ostensibly defensive in nature, right? So the use of machine learning for ballistic missile defense and hypersonics and or things like this, ship defense, I think that in those instances where a human cannot react fast enough, where the trajectory of whatever is incoming is clearly not another human body, right, coming from outer space or something. The use of autonomy for lethal decisions in those cases are clear wins to me, right? When it comes to this kind of hunter aspect, I find I'm very, very morally wary of that. Because
you're concerned about the maybe deficiencies of the system that controls it?
I'm concerned about the deficiencies of the technical deficiencies of actually being able to say that I've identified a hostile combatant, to Paul's point. Identifying hostility and hostile intent is almost impossible for people, let alone for creating an image classification and a data set to do that. I can have them identify weapons, AK-47, tank, whatever, but hostile intent, not so much.
So,
well, you asked, so there's the technical side of it, but the moral side of it is, again, to Paul's point, right? There is this thing about moral responsibility, and moral agents are those agents that can be held responsible.
Right.
And so in this sense, right, I don't want to offload or create the incentive to offload moral responsibilities to machines that are not moral agents.
That are not,
Moral agents,
yeah.
right?
So in fact, even if I could create the whole ecosystem around it that you'd like to see, you still would not do what I think Paul and I would do, would say it would be okay in that circumstance.
Not in this kind of like send it out for an indefinite amount of
Yeah.
time to hunt people down.
Well, you
No,
can,
I would-
now you're dressing it up, but
I did. I'm dressing up
Yeah.
the drone that can hunt for terrorists in real time.
no, these are wonderful, benign things, but we'll deal with that separately. Let me just get to the second thing, and then Pat, you can get in as well if you like, which is if I had a converse world where I had all these machines, and I proposed, I've got a great idea, I'm going to introduce humans, and I'm going to send humans out there as military units to go do all this. I think if somebody proposed that to me in that world, I'd say, oh my God, I need a whole ecosystem to control them, et cetera. And still, I know historically they're going to go bad, there are going to be massacres, there are going to be all kinds of terrible failures in those circumstances. So is one more morally admirable or likely than the other? Do I, from a strictly prudential standpoint, have greater capability to control the humans or the machines?
I mean,
You three are looking like, oh my God, we should just be talking with ethicists. We don't need this guy.
no, I mean, you're right. People are messy and we get angry and we do a lot of wrong things. I think what makes that situation tough is because that is not our starting point. Our starting point isn't that
Right.
everything's controlled by machines and war is controlled by machines. Even if it were, it might not be a bad idea to have some human beings in it, to have skin in the game. Because again, war is always terrible, right? Destructive. That's the whole point of war. And without skin in the game, there's hardly a barrier to choosing to attack, choosing armed conflict. So you're right. It's paradoxical. I mean, we're deliberately putting our lives on the line when we don't have to in this machine world. But if you're talking about a human activity called war that affects other human lives, I think it's better to have some responsibility or some skin in the game, meaning that there needs to be a responsible decision maker. But it's a tough scenario because that's not our starting point.
Yeah, and to double down on Pat's point too, right? Like, yes, war is terrible, right? It's a scourge, as they say, a scourge on the face of this earth. However, right, humans do fail spectacularly, right? Humans are bad at all sorts of things. But as we heard about from a project earlier today about, kind of creating an artificial theory of mind, right? Can we get agents to have a theory of mind? We do have a theory of mind of other people, right? We have that. And so we kind of know when people will fail and where they'll fail. We kind of have estimates, right? Clearly there's like one-offs and there's things that you didn't foresee, but generally like we have a pretty good beat on when people will fail. If you're tired, you're going to get into a car accident. You can mitigate around that. We do not have a theory of mind of machines. Machines fail spectacularly, weirdly, right? So, we don't have a good estimate of when those systems will fail. So you're saying, I think that there's different ways of saying, well, if I could just have a machine replace a human, wouldn't it be better because I've saved the human's life? Well, that means that you've, premised that saving human life is the best moral thing, right? So that's a very consequentialist, utilitarian view. And if you're not a consequentialist, you may be like, I don't care, I want there to be dignity arguments, which are more Kantian-based. And so depending upon the value you have, you'll make different estimations about which world is more preferable. And you have to then think about, okay, well, if I had that world, how weird is it going to be? Because these machines don't think like us.
Mm-hmm. And even if machines can outperform human beings by far, it's still not a slam dunk that you ought to deploy them. Let me give you an example from the world of self-driving cars. I do a lot of work in this area. So there's about 40,000 road deaths in the US every year, right? So auto fatalities. Let's say autonomous cars can slash that rate by 90%, right? Is that enough to say that we should feel them? It's consequentialists might think so. I mean, you save 90% of lives, that's a huge deal. Thousands and thousands, campus full of people saved every year. But I don't think that's the end of the story, because failure patterns matter. as Heather pointed out. We know how human beings fail in driving. Drunk driving, Texan driving, distracted driving, and there are legal remedies for that. There's responsibilities. But we're not clear on how machine fails. So let me give you an example of how a self-driving car could possibly fail. Right now, we know that computer vision is still not great. I mean, it's a lot better than it used to be 5, 10 years ago, but it's not nearly as good as it is in human beings, right? What a 2-year-old could trivially do with her eyeballs, it's very hard for a computer to do. One thing computers have a hard time recognizing, especially when we talk about facial recognition, is people of dark skin, right? People of color. Part of the reason is that
women of color in particular.
In women of color. Part of the reason is they didn't have those people in the development process to say, hey, maybe we should check if our facial recognition works on these folks here. So imagine a self-driving car could slash fatality rates by 90%, but everyone it kills is a small black child, right?
Because it didn't see it.
Because it couldn't see it. Now, some people might latch on to that 90% savings, but a heck of a lot of people would say, wait a minute, are we making the right trade-off here? Yeah, you're saving a lot of lives, but now you have new victims.
So if I can say so, and I recognize it's inflammatory, I think you guys as ethicists and philosophers are quite matter-of-factly applying a double standard. You're saying, well, we'll tolerate a lot of things in humans because we're familiar with it, we're used to it, et cetera. We know it. And in the machines, it's unfamiliar, et cetera. And if a machine, for example, exhibited racial bias, it would be deeply offensive to us. And I agree with you, it would be and should be deeply offensive to us. But the difference between the machine and the human is that with the machine, we're forced to come to grips with this. We're programming, et cetera. And it's new, and so we think this is morally unjust. But all the time, we're tolerating racism, blunders, 40,000 deaths, et cetera, from these human beings.
I'm not certain that Pat or I
Drinking.
are saying that we're tolerating or condoning in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I can equally be morally, like appalled at particular behaviors in people.
Right.
It's just, can I predict it? And then do I have different types of remediations that I can put in place beforehand?
And you think people are more predictable than machines?
To other humans, sure. How do you think we train machines to be predictable when it comes to human actions, right?
But don't we recognize that though there's a lot of talk about opaqueness in machines and the like, Tversky and Kahneman and others show us that we don't really understand very often how people think, and that they think in all kinds of ways that are illogical. And Paul, you've looked at the numbers of instances. Blackheart's is a good example of this in the literature, where units go awry in the field. And we have human mechanisms for controlling this, we try to, but our control is so imperfect. So I don't know why I would think that the problems of these in machines, which are real, become intolerable, and the problems in people are tolerable. Should we just let Paul answer?
Well, I think you make a good point, which is to say that there are lots of places where there are these problems of bias or mistakes or cognitive weaknesses that people have. I mean, look at things like sentencing in the judicial system, right?
Yeah,
we know that what the willingness of people to give someone parole depends on the time of day and their blood sugar level and things like that. So those things exist today, but to some extent, we live with it because that's the only other way to do it. There's no other way to do it. There's no alternative, right? And now what's interesting is that machines, I think you're right, sort of shine a light on these things. Where now as we start to have to program rules, you say, well, what should the rules be? Right? We've just been basing it on what humans do, their best judgment. What would that best judgment be? And I do think that in many cases that gives us an opportunity to improve a lot of these things because you're forced to identify existing problems, social problems, or prejudices or biases that people have, and you're able to then write down a set of ideally better rules for machines.
I would actually answer your question about this double standard differently. I would say, yeah, there might be a double standard. Part of the reason is what Paul said, that there's no other way of doing it, where life is messy. But also part of it is that we can handle human messiness. We have systems in place for that. So that's a little bit more addressable than machines. Now, when it comes to machines, so what are we doing now? We're trying to develop AI that maybe has agency, and we're wringing our hands. We're thinking, oh my gosh, this thing might have agency. What if it does something bad? This isn't a new problem. This is a very old problem. In fact, you all here deal with this every day. This is the problem of having children. Little autonomous agents, any of whom can grow up to be the next Hitler, right? Yet we don't have the same conversations about licensing parenthood. Maybe we should, but we already have pre-existing commitments to liberty, privacy, and a lot of other values that make us say, well, that humans are messy and we just have to make do. Not the same case at all with machines. In fact, if we wanted to...
Not just the same case with machines because they're new?
Well, because we don't know their mental models, as Heather said. So for our kids, we put them through school, we train them, we have institutions in place to try to make sure they're not the next Hitler, to tend them. We don't know how to do that with machines. We're not quite sure how they would operate. You can't just put them through school.
Well, and for the math geeks out there, right? Humans are predictable in large numbers, right? In groups, right? The law of large numbers. I can figure out what a person's going to do, like not a person, but I can figure out what people will do in this kind of group-like behavior.
Right.
But I can't figure out what the individual within that group will do, right? Statistics kind of starts to break down at when you're like, what is Richard going to do? Unless I have a huge pattern of data on Richard's history.
Yeah, as my performance in this panel suggests. Right.
So I
talk about Hitler models. Sorry, go ahead.
Can't be on an ethics panel without bringing up Hitler. So
this is Pat's fault. It's not mine. A machine would never have brought up this analogy. Go ahead. Sorry, Adam.
9. So I think so thinking about, right, like figuring out what people can do, we can because we have these kind of general patterns that we know and we have mathematical models to deal with them, but the N of 1, the one person is going to be hard to get, right? That is also, so that's something that, we might think about, not tolerate, but understand and plan for and predict and have the side rails and the guard rails. But the other thing too, and this is what, I think gets missed over in a lot of the conversations, when we talk about all of the human failings, right? We need machines for human failings. Sure, there's human failings. But there's also so many instances when there's war or armed conflict where people are doing the right thing. We just don't have observable observations of those, right? I don't have a data set of like when every single Army Ranger does the right thing at the right time. I only have an observation of when it goes bad, right? And then it gets plastered everywhere. And so you say, well, look how horrible something is, right? Look how horrible what these people did over here. And then it becomes attributed to the entire organization. You're like, well, actually, you probably have, maybe a 1 or 2% bad brunch or bad actions at one time. But you don't have the observations of the other 98% of the time. So I just kind of think that, in talking about, we need machines because humans fail so often, I go, maybe, or maybe that's not true. Maybe we don't feel that often. Maybe we actually just don't have the data to show us how good we are half the time.
Well, let me just, I want to close out this part of the discussion and then come to a different kind of problem, which is actually suggested by your comment, Paul. But just on this part, what I take from this is that it isn't evident that machines are necessarily less good decision makers from any number of standpoints ethically than humans. But we've created enough of an ecosystem to be comfortable and have enough track record to be comfortable with the humans, at least somewhat comfortable, even when they exhibit racism, et cetera. And we need to develop that with respect to machines as a prerequisite to moving to a stage where they're more widely employed. But some of us, I think Paul and I, would think that there isn't an intrinsic reason why you couldn't get there if you can come deal with those things. But let me just suggest that go ahead.
Well, you finish what you're saying, but then I want to follow up on that because I see it a little differently.
After you.
Well, I think some of your questions are getting at this question of sort of, are humans or machines better at these decisions? Or as machines get better over time, should we prefer humans for some reason or another?
I'm sorry, Paul, what I really meant was not to make a suggestion that they're better, but just to suggest that we shouldn't disqualify them because they exhibit these faults. Because we come to grips with these challenges in the human context, we might come to grips with them in the machine context.
So I guess what I'd say is when I look at this is that human and machine cognition is qualitatively different, right? And so it's not simply one of, what's the higher failure rate? It's that machines and humans fail in very different kinds of ways. So that suggests that whether you prefer one or the other depends a lot on the type of problem you're trying to do. If you're trying to do a problem where the environment is relatively controlled, the problem is relatively bounded, and we have a clear sense of what better looks like, what is better performance, my suspicion is that we are likely to be able to build machines that can do that over time. Maybe not today, but eventually. If the goal is to put cars on the road that kill fewer people, if that is the metric, we'll get there someday. I don't know on what timeline, but we'll get there, right? When there are decisions that require understanding context, those are things that we know machines do very, very poorly at least today. Obviously, there's great folks at DARPA and others that are working on fixing those problems. That's a lot of what we've heard about today. But there's this brittleness to machine cognition where if the context changes, they just fall apart, right? Whereas humans are more capable of muddling through things and adapting to situations where no one told me what to do in this situation, but I can make a reasonable judgment. That many people would say, well, maybe it's not what I would do, but I can understand the logic in that. Whereas a lot of times we see these machines and they'll fail and they'll go from brilliant to incredibly stupid in a millisecond. And so that I think does shift how we think about using that, setting aside from the fact that I do think there are some decisions that we might want humans to make because it is intrinsically valuable that humans make them, because there's an asymmetry in understanding the weight of a decision, right? So let's think about criminal sentencing, for example, right? If what you really want is you want uniformity in sentencing, machines would be better than humans. If what you really want is people to consider the particulars of every individual case, if you say every person is different, I want to understand all of the aggravating and mitigating circumstances before I make a sentencing decision. Machines, we don't know how to do that, actually. We don't know how to build a machine that could do that. And a machine certainly could not weigh things like the moral value. What does it feel for that person to be in that situation? Have they already been punished enough? That's a thing that a machine just is totally
what this
incapable
brings
of.
home to me, though, is that it's not so much that we have different visions about machines. We have different visions about people. And you gave the example earlier, referring back, I expect, to the Tversky and Kahneman work, where actually they didn't do it, but they observed that Israeli parole boards, when they made these judgments, made very different judgments after lunch, as I recollect, more lenient than they did before lunch. And if you came up before the parole board at 11 a.m., your chances of having a severe restriction on your liberty were much greater than if you came up at 2 p.m. So we also have things like, you talk about humans' ability to muddle through and adapt, Milgram experiments, et cetera, where if you give people an experimental context where they're told to inflict pain as a part of an experiment and they're white-coated people, they wind up doing things that they would regard as outrageous, that they're pained to do, but the situation manipulates them. So I don't feel like in the example you chose, parole boards, people are sitting there making these individual evaluations, weighing the moral worth of the individual. They're spending 5 minutes on a case. And why shouldn't a machine do it if the machine will, in fact, be less influenced by racism, et cetera, et cetera? What, Paul, after you...
I guess my point would be, again, I think it depends on what you want to do, right? If you want to do is increase uniformity, if you say, look, there's these disparities based on time, based on racial bias, other things, machines are going to do a better job of that.
We agree on that. But
right? But if you do say, what I really want is, I want a human to appreciate the value of each person's circumstance.
But Paul, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. You're pursuing an illusion. And for that reason, you're trying to so value the illusion, you're not taking the gains of uniformity.
I don't think that's always the case.
You're right. It's not always, but
I think
in the great majority of cases.
There are some examples where people do stop to think about this.
But they're rare, Paul. That's not the way the system operates as a whole. And that's not the way you would operate a system. I mean, you would judge the system if you looked at it.
Well,
Sorry.
But so parole and sentencing, two different aspects. I think what Paul, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I think that the idea is that the sentiment is that when it comes to things like the systems of justice and when it comes to things that affect rights, we hope the normative standard is the ideal, that individuals, at least within a Western culture and a Western rule of law is that the individual is the rights holder, is the rights bearer, and will be judged by a jury of their peers, and a judge who is competent and everything else will then issue sentence in accordance with the law, which of course is actually quite general and universal, but also very, very malleable in various situations because it's so high level, right? So in that instance, right, as it works as the ideal, it's a process. We think that justice, the just outcome is the result of the process, but it's this process that is deeply involved in the argumentation of individuals with other individuals, of presenting to a jury of your peers. Hold on. And so the idea that people are inherently involved in this process, right? That I have to justify my actions to my peers, that a person who is competent and a human who has listened to all of this will then issue judgment. That to me says that what's part in process that's so important in that process is that it's the people and the judgment of the people like me, my peers. If I automate that to some extent, what am I mean, I'm automating my peers? Like, that seems really weird to me. And the data set that I would draw off of, right, whatever the, am I looking at, how many cases have been tried like this? What were the demographics of those cases? What were the demographics of those people? Are there gerrymandering effects for the different jurisdictions? All of these different things will create structural level patterns within the data, which we saw with ProPublica, that will then be reinforced and reified and manifested in the end product. And so if you know that your structural system is rigged, guess what? You're going to have an AI that's doing it as well. So I'm not certain that I would say, one, uniformity is the goal, and so that's the value. I think the goal is justice, that is by a jury of your peers in your process of that. And then two, just even uniformity at a structural level can be very, very bad.
See, I think what's fundamental here is that there's a first level that we all quickly see and that I think is very important, which is that the coming of the machine as a decision maker potentially forces us to clarify as programmers things that were implicit, that we may in fact differ on, that we manage to put aside in day-to-day life. And that's a very valuable function for us as humans, but a very challenging one in terms of the programming, which is part of what constrains your enthusiasm for the machine. We're not going to be very good at that. But the second thing, I think, is that we function in our day-to-day lives with some idealized vision of the world, which in fact, when we come to grips with this and the possibility of machines, gives us an illusion of a standard, this is why I say double standard, about what the machine should do. And as an example, I take your very apt and inspiring comments, Heather, about the legal system. That's not the way it works. You know that. Yes, in rare cases, cases go to a jury of peers, et cetera. But in 90% of the cases, they're plea bargained. The cases have huge variance based on race and wealth and so forth. So if we introduced automation, we could make gains in those areas potentially. We could argue about it. But all I'm trying to say is we would ultimately make judgments about the role of the machine, I think, according to this rich array of values. But we should make it without illusions about how the system is functioning now. And there's no reason a priori to believe that the machine system would function less well to further the causes of justice that you spoke about. Pat, I'm sorry.
So I wonder if this would be helpful. The conversation's been fairly abstract now.
Yeah.
Let me reframe it in this question that I think makes it more personal. So let's assume that, yeah, human judges are biased, they get hangry and so on. And whatever failings an AI judge would have. Let me ask you, Richard, if you were in front of a judge, you committed a crime, would you rather be judged by an AI judge or a human judge?
Definitely a human judge.
Doesn't that tell us something about whether we want humans versus machines doing any kind of other decisions?
Yes.
With humans, with a human judge, at least we have the possibility of mercy, for instance. I mean, maybe they look at each case and maybe they take pity. A machine, it's hard to imagine how you can even program and code a machine to do that. If we're talking military machines, there's no chance there's going to be another thing like the Christmas truce during World War I. That ain't never going to happen. And we're still talking about 100 years later because it's such an important symbolic moment, right, for humanity and for warfare. So I think mercy and compassion are potentially unique elements that the humans have that the machines don't have. Let me ask a similar question for autonomous cars. Would you rather get killed by a self-driving car or a drunk human driver? I don't know about you, but I mean, I think, you might say, okay, if you're dead, you're dead. But also imagine you have a family that you love, right? So, I mean, there might be a lot of reasons that way for choosing a human drunk driver, because at least they have the possibility of expressing contrition, right? So they could be sorry. They could make you whole again with financial compensation. They serve as cautionary tales to address social problems like drinking and texting. Whereas if a machine does it, you might not even know why it did it in the first place. And a company might just get off with a simple, strict liability, maximum penalty, or so.
So let me suggest that, first of all, the reason why I'd choose a judge is the reason you pointed to earlier, which is familiarity. That's a big factor. Mm-hmm. Imagine it's 8,000 years ago, and the three of you were impaneled as a panel of ethicists to consider a new thing, which is this dramatic innovation where we're going to take animals and tame them for domestic production. And I'll start with the wolf and make him a dog, etc. I think, if I'm hearing you right, you'd say, no, this is really undesirable because we know how humans perform when they pull the plow rather than an ox. These things have their own will and volition. I can't predict them and control them, etc. But eventually, with time, you'd grow, as humankind has, comfortable with them, and we wind up using them. And I think a lot of our anti-machine hesitancy relates to that. Heather, you look like this is crazy.
I think that is so far off. As a former person who trained animals and marine mammals in particular,
okay,
I'm like, no, right? Like that's the familiarity argument is. You can, if you want to use that as one line to say, well, then everything unfamiliar, that's crazy. Then none of us would ever try any new food, right? Like that's just, we'd always eat the same thing every day, all day. So that's just kind of silly. But
this is kind of yuppie argument for change.
But it's like I don't want to be painted as a Luddite either. Right?
Oh,
I mean,
right.
I love technology. I love working at the edge of technology. I study artificial intelligence and robotics and cyber, and I love it. And I think about all sorts of different aspects of this. So I think in that respect, it's like, no, it's what is the right way to build the technology? What are the appropriate tasks that the nature and the maturity of the technology is appropriate for use in? And not to build more of like these grandiose claims of well, if we could do this thing that's really contentious for people, would you like the machine to do it too? And you're like, well, I'm still certain that I don't know I would be okay with a person doing it, let alone a machine doing it. And so I think, kind of making sure that the conversation about ethics is really tied to, responsible research and innovation, that we can create technological artifacts that pursue our goals and our values in such a way that we use it appropriately and within the bounds of what we feel comfortable with as a society.
Would you accept some support for that argument from someone as heretical as me, which is, I think, an important lesson for all of you, which is if you really care about the technology, this is an additional point in support of what you're saying, if you really care about the technology, then you need to make sure that it is introduced in conditions which have the qualities that you've been pressing for. Because otherwise, when the accidents occur, as they inevitably will, and the miscarriages, et cetera, the reaction, because of the unfamiliarity and because of what I think of as the human bias, will put at risk everything you're doing. And therefore, it isn't just a matter of ethics, which alone ought to be the basis of our feelings about this, but it's also a matter of prudential consideration if you're a technology advocate. And that's your point about you're not anti-Luddite, in fact, you're pro-technology.
Right.
I think we've been talking about things that humans do well and things that humans screw up, right? And I think you framed this a little bit, Richard, as sort of but people do all these bad things, so machines could do better. And I guess what I'd say is people do both, right?
Yes.
People do both these things. You look at criminal justice sentencing or war or anything else, Pat mentioned the truces in World War I. there have been instances throughout war of people engaging in moments of mercy, of seeing an enemy soldier, bathing in the river, smoking a cigarette, and people engaging in these moments of saying, I'm going to stop and I'm not going to kill this person in this instant. There's this moment where, in all of the brutality of war, humanity sneaks through. Machines would take that away. It's also true that let's not sugarcoat things. That's not most of war, actually, right? Most of war is actually horrific brutality. My point would simply be that, if we can use technology to improve on these human failings, absolutely we should. And we should look for opportunities to do that. But let's not just assume that humans are useless. It's not just that humans understand context, it's that humans understand the value of things, of people, and that we are at risk in some areas of giving up something if we eliminate humans entirely. That there are instances where having some humanity in this decision, the ability to appeal to a judge, the ability for a soldier to say, I'm going to not shoot this rifle this time, there's some value in that.
So let me ask, go ahead, Pat.
To pick up on Paul, I think human ability is really underrated. We're actually a lot better than folks give us credit for. So back to self-driving cars, 40,000 people die a year. That's a big number, but not in the context of all the trillions of vehicle miles driven every year. So in the US, there's one statistical death every 100 million miles. That means you guys would have to live 100 lifetimes before you could expect to be in a fatal accident. Self-driving cars today, they've driven 10 million, maybe 100 million miles. They've already killed several people, which is very uncomfortably early, right, if you think that they're going to perform better than human beings. Yeah, I think the jury's still out on whether machines outperform humans, even in the driving context, which has been well explored since DARPA's Grand Challenge back in the 90s. Right?
Pat comes from California, so he's particularly credible about driving patterns. So I think this is.
And I would actually like to say that it's not the 90s, and it was with DARPA in the Strategic Computing Initiative from 1983 with the autonomous land vehicle, so the lick glider, for seeing all of that stuff. So it goes all the way to 83. So congratulate yourselves on that one.
So let me ask the three of you, we've discussed fairly intensely certain aspects of this. Is there an aspect of your thinking about ethical and philosophic issues as they apply to artificial intelligence that you particularly would like to flag for this audience, or you'd like us to talk about in our remaining 15 minutes or so? Is there anything special we haven't touched on that's important to you?
So you mentioned just recently something about being surprised, right? That is, if a machine fails in a certain way, we're going to be surprised and outraged. And I think that's right. If we don't educate people in advance, if you don't think about ethics in advance, yeah, you're going to be surprised when a Tesla plows into a parked bright red fire truck on the 405 freeway near LA. You're going to be surprised. And to avoid that, and bad things happen when you're surprised. Right? People tend to overreact and make rash judgments. So I think you need to get ahead of that surprise, ahead of that PR backlash. If you're talking about a DARPA technology, potentially this means backlash in the public support of whatever conflict you're engaged with. So I think the stakes are high.
Does this also push you, Pat, towards a concern to try and develop norms and treaty control mechanisms so that other people's development of AI doesn't generate that backlash and surprise? I know this is something you've thought a fair amount about, Paul. Do you have some? We can see with every technology we've developed the phenomenon of accidents. Nuclear technology, you look at the Broken Arrows website and the like, there's extraordinary near catastrophes, and in some instances, substantial number of fatalities. We're not smarter than the people who dealt with AI were, with atomic technology, nuclear technology. We're not smarter than they were when they dealt with that technology. Our ability to comprehend what we're doing with AI isn't greater, so these things will occur. Do we have options that we ought to be pursuing in this arena that you think would be particularly fruitful, any of the three of you, with regard to norms and treaties?
I mean, we're seeing active discussions get underway about things like regulating in the United States facial recognition technology, bot disclosure laws. California signed a bot disclosure law so that If a machine is impersonating a human, it has to tell you that it's a bot. So I think that there's that's an important discussion that's got to get underway because the technology is becoming real enough now that harm from AI is not hypothetical.
Right.
Those things have happened. We've had people that are harmed from deep fakes being used to do revenge porn attacks, where someone takes someone's face and grafts it onto a pornographic video. We're certainly seeing China build a digital surveillance state using things like facial recognition technology. So I do think it's important to have those conversations now. When you start looking internationally, those are just much harder. Our institutional mechanisms as a sort of global society they're much weaker to find ways to do that. And they are in some ways weakest in the space of warfare, where, what's the enforcement mechanism? There's really not a good one, right? And so that's not to say that there are no examples of successful treaties and laws. There are, but we just watched the collapse of a major treaty, the INF Treaty, because Russia was cheating and eventually the US kind of pulled out. So I think it's just very challenging to find conditions where that's likely to be successful, at least in the military space.
Well, to follow on some of Paul's comments here, so Paul and I and Pat have all been involved in the international arena on this at the United Nations, looking at whether or not to regulate autonomy in weapon systems. And so we've seen the best and the brightest really kind of come out to try to help diplomats think about this. And one of the things that is readily apparent is that it's really hard to even get people to agree on a definition of what autonomy is or what AI is. And so from a technologist standpoint, they might say, well, that's just completely asinine. Here's this thing, and this is what we agree. But not so when you're starting to talk about it in a regulatory space. Domestically, I do a bit of work thinking about AI governance and policy, and as well as AI ethics, and even getting people to understand what I mean by AI or what they mean by AI is incredibly difficult. And so having those kinds of discussions about boundary setting, I would say, really needs to happen. Not just public education, but educating our leaders that AI is not magic, it's math. And really thinking about, this is how you can use it. These are the types of problems that are well defined to use, either machine learning or have hybrid systems. What are the kinds of controls? And here's, if it's a robotic system or a cyber system. And really just kind of doing maybe some AI boot camps, right, for policymakers and people who are going to be creating those regulations or norms. I think is really going to be important going in the future. That said, I also think that one of the things that at least DARPA and hopefully people in this room are interested in thinking about is thinking about this kind of ecosystem around artificial intelligence applications. This is going to get hairy really quick, right? With the advent of 5G, with the Internet of Things, and with more and more AI applications coming online, you are going to have a ubiquitous kind of presence of AI throughout all sorts of different things at all the time. And you could have these kind of complex interactions and emergences that you don't really understand or know or can foresee or design for. And so I think understanding that and starting to build this ecosystem of norms and governance and use and policies, and thinking of it almost, as well as technological fixes, thinking of it almost like we thought about, to draw off of Richard's discussion about nukes before, drawing off of our thinking about nuclear surety from the 60s and 70s and the kinds of complexes that we had to create and build and have something more along the lines of AI surety, right? Do I need technological fixes and where? Do I need better testing, verification, and validation methods for deep learning? I do. Okay, I should make that a priority, right? Do I need to have different kinds of test range for different types of systems? I do. Okay, let's think about that. And then how do I, maybe think about walling off various systems from one another or creating them to fail gracefully rather than deadly, or what are the complex interactions? And then that's just the tech side, right? Now I have to think about the governance. Now I have to think about the policy. Now I have to think about the training and the practices and the procedures and the doctrine and the ConOps and all of the different things that go along with that. And that's a human problem, right? That's not a tech problem.
I think you're completely right, but it seems to me there's a problem here, and I wonder how the three of you think about it. And the problem relates simply to the speed of adaptation. Historically, what happens with technologies in the experience that I can think about is that we have phenomena where, as with the automobile, the technology comes in and then slowly the regulatory mechanisms catch up. And we reduce the number of driving deaths, et cetera. But we have a whole system. We get first licensing, and then we get composite materials, and we get seat belts, and we get enforcement of speed, et cetera, et cetera. And over years, decades, trailing the technology, we get that. Now we get these high-speed innovations of technologies that respond to exponential growth in the Moore's Law kind of way. And the legislative social system and the ecosystem you're demanding doesn't develop at Moore's Law speeds.
It doesn't, but it can start with the technologists who build the technology, make explicit those things, right? So the people who are creating that fastest change, if they think about it from a responsible research and innovation perspective, from an ethics-first design perspective, and they make very clear, I can use it here, I can't use it here, here's what this is, here's what this is.
And how do you feel about that in the AI world? Do you feel as though that's a...
It's starting, you know, within the major AI companies, they have ethics and society teams. You know, when you think about OpenAI and its decision recently not to release a full model of a machine learning ability to do natural language processing and create all sorts of artificial text, they decided to withhold that because they thought it was a risk. I think that this is the kind of movement that we are seeing at the very cutting edge. And now I hope that it kind of percolates, and it's that society of people that are doing that foundational research that can kind of hold the edges while the rest of us start to catch up.
And on the one hand, we had it with genetic testing as the biologists themselves became self-regulating. And on the other hand, we get phenomena like cybersecurity, where the security is left to catch up later. Or I think about plastics. In 1951, there were no plastics. And then they were introduced commercially. And it's 60, 70 years later that we're worried about the fact that 80% of them haven't been recycled or burned. That's a long lag time, which generates a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the plastics example is great. I think a big part of the problem is our situation is a little bit like the frog in the slowly boiling pot, right? There's no one big event. There's no Manhattan Project or a Pearl Harbor where we all wake up and say, oh crap, we're at a crossroads here. This is a slow burn. But you see, robots have already taken over a lot of jobs. You go to the grocery store, there used to be 10 cashiers. Now there's one cashier supervising 10 robot clerks, right? Self-checkout. And the change is coming incrementally and by various sectors, not all at once. And I think that's part of the problem that's holding back organized international action.
Do you want to comment, Pat, in the closing minutes here about the job and the human consequences associated with job displacement from AI?
Yeah, so jobs are going to be lost. I think a lot of folks widely predict that truck drivers are going to be one of the first because self-driving trucks are coming, and truck driver jobs are one of the most popular jobs in the country. And the usual line from economics is, oh, don't worry, they're going to find higher value jobs. We can reskill them, retrain them. That sort of sounds like a Ponzi scheme to me. I'm not sure the math works out. You can't expect all the truck drivers to be trained to be programmers or coders. And even if they can, I mean, is this going to scale for other industries too? So, I mean, I'd be worried about that. When you have mass unemployment, I mean, unemployment, okay, maybe not here nor there as long as you can manage the disruption. But mass unemployment very quickly, that could lead to things like crime, a lot of pressure on our welfare system, and so on. So there are big issues. That said, I mean, I think a lot of people make a virtue out of work, especially in America, right? I mean, we have this puritanical work ethic. We think we'd lose our identity.
This is a very laid-back audience. I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, so personally, I mean, I would look forward to a world without work. I know a lot of people would be uncomfortable with that.
Re-enter the California perspective.
But this is not, as Pat says, this is not new. In 1955, the U.S. Congress held a series of hearings on the future of automation and work and when all of these things, and they said there's going to be mass unemployment and there needs to be reskilling and upskilling. And it's the obligation, this is the congressional hearings found, it's the obligation of the companies and the enlightened executives is what they call them. Enlightened executives to retrain their people and then send them out into new jobs. And it's not our job, government, to do that. So, you know, Google's and Microsoft's, and whoever, the trucking companies, it's their jobs. And that, to me, that was in 1955. So we're kind of like on the back foot here a little bit.
Yeah.
So I've seen a whole range of estimates on this, from people predicting things like double-digit unemployment, the kinds of Depression-era unemployment, or the things you saw in, that led up to the rise of fascism in Europe, all the way to like, it'll create more jobs. It's clearly not going to be the same jobs, right? And that's really the challenge is, reskilling, that's not going to happen automatically. How do you bake in public policy measures that actually allow people to be trained up? The best analysis that I've seen was done by McKinsey, where they went below the level of jobs, and they looked at the tasks that people were doing in those jobs across the whole US economy. And they found that roughly half of all tasks currently being done in the US economy could be automated with existing technology. That's mind-blowing. And it was a very small number of jobs could be totally eliminated. Parking lot attendant might be one of them, right? You're going to leave and you feed them your receipt and you interact with a robot, right? But about less than 5% of jobs could be totally eliminated. But most jobs have some fraction of things. And it's routine cognitive and physical labor. When you take that analysis that they've done and plug it against Bureau of Labor and Statistics data on those workforce, you find that that is disproportionately affects the youngest people in the workforce. So people like 18 to 25. Now the good news is they have the most time to adapt. If you're hitting people in their 50s and 60s, like they're right up on retirement, how are you going to reskill those folks? Much harder. I think the challenge there is, and folks like Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee have looked at this before and looked at wage stagnation being tied to, some of it tied to automation, and the value of education, right? So if you give people higher education, they're more capable of performing those higher cognitive tasks that are more valued in this knowledge-based economy. We need to make sure that we have the tools available in society to do that. If what we're doing is we're pulling the rug out from underneath people, and that we're taking away that barista job that allows them to pay their way through school, then we're widening the income gap. And we're making things much harder for people to climb their way up in society. So those are actually solvable problems, but we need to make sure that we have a society that actually pays attention to that and takes care of people, gives people the skills they need, and doesn't say like, oh, someone will reskill them. Who's going to reskill them?
The enlightened executive.
Right, like, we need to think intelligently about how as a society we're going to actually navigate our way through those challenges.
Let me just say a couple of things in conclusion, because our time's up. Having presented a darker view of some aspects of human beings, here I think also we ought to see the extraordinary possibility. There's too much of a tendency now simply to think about work as it exists. And there may be huge opportunities for the arts, the assistance to the elderly, for teaching, et cetera, that might fundamentally transform the nature of human activity. I think it can't be looked at simply from an economic standpoint. People's identities are wrapped up in work. So we need to find identities like this. But I think as humans, we're capable of it. Every technology, as this trio is deeply aware, it creates huge challenges from the dislocations, of which we've discussed several, some of them psychological, some of them economic, some of them functional in day-to-day ways. I'm just very struck with how the Greeks resisted the entry of reading and writing. Oh my God, what could be more obvious? But wait a minute, from the Greek standpoint, this undermined the ability to memorize and seduced people away from talking to each other. And you can begin to see how you could extrapolate all these problems from people sitting alone and reading books. And the observation was made that they will regard it as too much a truth because they read it in a book rather than really talked about it and had to think out for themselves. So these problems are age-old, and we're seeing a manifestation in our age. In that manifestation, I think we're hugely helped by people like this trio. I've been aggressive in my questioning. I have a clear defense, which is DARPA programmed me to do it. But the underlying reality is that all of us, I think, need to aggressively come to grips with these questions. And you all are, I think, doing us an immense service in being at the cutting edge of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Perfect.